I've unmuted now, and it should be on. Should be on.
Should be on.
Okay, Kathy. So Kathy's muted her microphone. That's all. So she doesn't need. Okay. So we're ready to go.
Yeah, just hold on a second.
Hold on a second.
Okay, you're live.
We're live. Okay, folks. Welcome to Politics in the Pub. We're live. Yes, we're live. Let's try to switch the music. Yeah, I was just trying to get the music up. Okay. Okay. Welcome to Politics in the Pub. Thank you for being here instead of lying on a beach or sailing your large catamarans around somewhere. Let me first of all, on your behalf, acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Given that we are talking about civil liberties in this part of the world, it's pretty germane to also make a reference to the situation of the First Nations people of this country. Now, we're going to talk about civil liberties, Wendy and I, in terms of two particular cases. The treatment of the Labour MP in the Upper House, Shaukat Mossameh, and the brave activist protester, Violet Coker, whom luckily for me, Wendy is going to speak to. I'm much more familiar with the life and times of Shaukat Mossameh. Let me give you a bit of the introduction. We're in January 2020. This man's been in the Labour Party for over 30 years. He's a former mayor of Rockdale. He happens to be the first Muslim, the only Muslim ever elected to the Australian Federal Parliament. He is pretty supportive of the large number of Chinese constituents at the time when, if you recall, during the outbreak of COVID, there was a lot of anti-Chinese protest and feeling, and some would say discrimination here. And Shaukat, of course, is also well known as being a major supporter of the Palestinian people, for which he draws a lot of criticism and attention from what I would call the Zionist lobby in the state parliament and elsewhere. Now, fast forward a bit to the federal parliament, which a few years before had passed a piece of legislation known as the Foreign Interference Act. it was an attempt by, in a way, for Morrison and Co to beat their chests and show how macho is Australia, that they would prosecute anybody who looked as though they were siding with what they call foreign actors to promote the interests of other governments. But by January, February 2020, the legislation had been dormant. They hadn't really found nobody had acted upon it. So there was a desperate need, in a way, for the intelligence services, the AFP, the politicians, to, as it were, find a reason for enacting this legislation. At that point, there appears a whole phalanx of people who decided that they were for Australia and against the Palestinians, included Ray Hadley and 2GB, the famous shock jocks, Peter Credlin on Sky News, a number of former Labour politicians, Stephen Conroy, Graham Richardson, and then, of course, there reappeared Peter Dutton, several journalists from the Sydney Morning Herald, the Daily Telegraph, and in Britain, the Daily Mail. And between March the 31st and April the 10th of 2020, there appeared 32 articles attacking Shaukat Mossalmain as a public relations servant, officer, representative of the Chinese Republic. If you look at the language, most of the cues came from Ray Hadley, not only from Ray Hadley of 2GB, but he had a whole series, as many as about 16 or 17 epithets that I counted. It called Shaukat this lowlife, this grub of a person, this train wreck, this representative of the Chinese Republic. This labeling went on for several days, or for about 10 days, between March the 31st and April the 10th. There are three particular characteristics to this, what I call the character assassination of a very generous, usually reserved but highly principled Labour Member of Parliament. Three techniques they used. The people who wanted to show that they were for Australia but against China. That was how to sketch in their identity with great certainty. The first technique was repetition. The second was to appear enormously confident about false claims. And the third technique was to pretend that they were a political party. So at the moment, we've got this alliance building between the media, sections of the media, and disgruntled politicians. Let's have a look at the repetition. That was picked up. The Ray Hadley commentary is picked up by somebody like Peter Credlin on Sky News, who says, if we've got foreign agency rules, somebody ought to look at this guy. He's been to China 9 times, she says. So what exactly was he doing there? Well, the answer was that he was a member of a group that supplied wheelchairs to different countries. He'd been several times supplying wheelchairs to a large orphanage in Shanghai. But of course, none of that is revealed. So that repetition that this guy is a lowlife and should be kicked out of the Labour Party, that gets repeated. Then there's this enormous confidence about the fake news, that he must be a threat to us. The leading journalist, investigative journalist from the Sydney Morning Herald, name escapes me at the moment, said he'd been watching Shaukat's activities, his pro-China activities, for weeks. And then he said, and I'll come to it in a minute, because a bit later, a few days later, the AFP appeared as part of the gang. So you've got this repetition of a threat to Australian democracy, contrary to the foreign interference legislation. In other words, he and his assistant in his office, who'd worked for him for 10 years and was an Australian citizen but of Chinese background, that was also how the suspicions were painted. I come to the third point about the union of the media and the politicians appearing as though they're a political party. Where Stephen Conroy, for example, said, "This man is a disgrace to the Labour Party." Kept on repeating this. It was a wonderful example in Freudian terms of somebody who uses projection, who attributes to other people what he feels about himself, namely a terrible disgrace to the Labour Party. The major mover and shaker for this notion that they should act politically came from Hadley and Jones, particularly Hadley, who tried to get the leader of the New South Wales State Labour Party on his programme at that time, Jodie Mackay. And he said on April the 3rd, look, she's in her bunker, she won't appear. She's the hero of the language, she won't appear. Let's dig her out, let's get her out of the bunker. She's got to be talking about this disgraceful guy. Eventually, a day later, Jodie appears on his programme. And he announces to her, the public want you to dismiss this guy. He repeats the language about him being a representative of the Chinese, that he's a lowlife and a train wreck. And she says, in response to him, in response to his demand, get rid of him, sack him, please, for the benefit of the public. She said, I know, Ray, his behaviour has been appalling. And a few days later, April the 7th, he was ejected from the Labour Party, resigned. So that the pressure had worked. So then what happens, of course, has a great deal of government and the implementation of legislation is in secret. Some of you in this audience know that very well. Fast forward to June the 25th in Canberra, in the magistrate's chambers at 10 o'clock at night. A magistrate signs a warrant for the AFP. By then there's been a phalanx of intelligence services, the AFP and particular politicians, including Dutton, who more or less said on other radio programs that Choquette was a traitor. So they sign a warrant. He agrees to the magistrate at 10 o'clock at night on June the 25th. Signs a warrant for the AFP saying that they can raid and inspect Choquette Mossamaine's home in Rockdale. 8 hours later, at 6 o'clock in the morning, a phalanx of the media, including with all their television dishes and radio equipment, some of them had travelled from Melbourne, are parked outside his house, waiting for the AFP to arrive, which they dutifully did at 6:30. 40 of them, who then spent in two shifts of 20 each, 19 hours in his home, terrorized his elderly parents and his young son, kept on telling him that he wasn't the subject of their investigation, that they didn't suspect him of anything, but they took away samples of dust and hair from his car, and they went back over documents of 10 years, including the unearthing of his initial speech to Parliament. So you'd think this was Belarus or Russia or Myanmar or Israel's treatment of the Palestinians, but in fact it was democratic, human rights respecting Australia. What exactly they took away, we're not absolutely certain, but the public observed the police going in and out with two large black boxes, which the media said, well, must have been the documents that represented forms of espionage. In fact, one of the boxes contained McDonald's hamburgers for the cops, and the other one contained Subway sandwiches, also for the cops. So they took them in full up. Yeah, they took them up full and distributed them to the 40 cops during their two shifts. And they took the black boxes full of espionage material out empty. I mean, in a way, it was kind of Shakespearean much ado about nothing, except that there was a helicopter, there were sniffer dogs, and they basically confirmed by the amount of attention that the media gave that he was as they said he was. And 48 hours later, Mackenzie, the Sydney Morning Herald investigative journalist, appeared on 60 Minutes, a program that had been rehearsing for days, if not weeks, saying that, that yes, he'd been indeed watched. This was possibly the most significant espionage raid since whenever that event occurred with the Petros, was it? So there was this sort of masturbated excitement in search of a spy or in search of a fifth columnist in democratic Australia. Go forward a bit more to early October, and the Privileges Committee of the State Parliament, to their credit, investigated the whole thing, completely exonerated Choquette, said it was a disgrace, and readmitted him, and he was readmitted to the Parliament. But there was no apology from Jodie Mackay. She just said she'd happily work with him in the future. There was certainly no apology or acknowledgement from the media, who had labelled him throughout that episode. Of course, the civil liberties of this politician were, you'd think they were restored at that point. Of course, they were not, because in a way, part of the issue is Palestine, not China. The two particular operators, one Victor Aladef, the former chair of the Jewish Board of Deputies, and a guy called Walter Cord, who's the chairman of the Israeli Labour Friends of Israel, greeted his earlier ejection from the Labour Party as something that which would benefit all the public of New South Wales. In other words, this wretched man, this wretched supporter of Palestine, that's at last we've got rid of it. The last disgraceful event occurred in November of last year, when Choquette, who'd been assistant president of the upper house, stood for re-election, and he was nominated. And the present Labour leader, to demonstrate that his principles were just as weak as Jodie Mackay's, blocked his nomination, said he couldn't even be nominated. He couldn't even try to be re-elected. At that point, Choquette resigns. There was a big event in the Parliament, which I attended, to say thank you to him and goodbye. And a lot of people, in particular, I remember Linda Burney, turned up to express their gratitude to somebody who'd been selfless in his service to the public and the victim of this complete indifference to civil liberties. In the what do you call it? The federal committee, what's it called? The committee that investigates abuses. It goes under comment. No, not ICANN. No, in the federal parliament. Yeah. King Carr pressed the chief of police, AFP, Rees Kershaw, many times, 3 or 4 occasions to my recall. How did the media at 6 o'clock on June the 26th, how did they know the police were about to arrive half an hour later? Who informed them? And he repeatedly said, I'll take that question on notice. In other words, the government, by avoidance, we never have found out any answer to that question. And you know, if you keep on at people, you eventually wear them out, and the whole issue is allowed to pass. Except in a way, the civil liberties issue has reappeared again, because Minns, and this is my connection to Wendy and Violet Coker, Minns said he thought the imprisonment of Violet Coker was a splendid idea, and he repeated what Perrottet said. And at that point, I'm thrilled to bits to be on the same platform as Wendy Baker.
Thanks.
I'll fix that.
Maybe.
Yeah,
Thanks, Stuart, and I'd like to recognise that we're on the land of the Gadigal people. I pay my respects to elders past and present. And I think in saying that, I pick up again on something Stuart said, that, we shouldn't forget the actually very heavy price in terms of civil liberties that First Nations people have paid on this land since colonisation. And just recently I've begun researching, and I hope to do something with the Munro family about this, but going back to the early 60s, a Wiradjuri man called Pat Wedge, and a young Aboriginal actor, was shot at point blank range in the back of the head at St. Peter's Station. And I'm hoping that we might be able to build a community campaign with the family, of course, and absolutely up to them. And we're yet to reach this stage, so I'm not launching into a campaign at this point, but it just reminded me of the terrible price that was paid. And when I was a young alternative journalist in Sydney, some of the first stories I wrote were about the bloodbath that occurred at the Empress Hotel in Redfern pretty regularly on a Saturday night, and no doubt some other nights of the week. When I was in Victoria Street, a young Aboriginal woman died in a house fire there. So, that itself, it's a massive catalogue of atrocities. Just also picking up a little bit from what Stuart said is, I think, look, it's stupid to make generalisation about, are we living in the most repressive times? Are we living in freer times? It's a really complicated question, but we are living, I think, in very repressive times. And I think it's very clear that debate in quite a few areas is being shut down. And obviously, Moslemain was very much a victim of that. And this thing that Stuart picked up on is very important, where you repeat something and you repeat something, and then the rest of the journalists sort of pick up on it and it becomes the truth. Another example of that is with Julian Assange, with the sexual assault allegations that were dropped, that never were a case, that just get slid into articles, just repeated and repeated. And that is all part of an actual character assassination campaign that's been remarkably effective in the media. But also, as a journalist, you know that you have sources, you have off-the-record sources, and you can very easily become a captive of your sources. And just watching the foreign affairs coverage on the ABC and the Australian Strategic Policy Institute and the way they're used as a source again and again, I must say it leads me to a point of not exactly despair, but certainly discouragement. So I think the protest laws, the anti-protest laws, I should say, are another example of what we're talking about and the way they went through Parliament. Now, actually, there have been laws passed in New South Wales, Tasmania, Victoria, and Queensland, but I'm just focusing on New South Wales. And I don't want to tell you a whole lot of stuff that you already know, because I absolutely know that on this occasion I'm talking to the converted, as they say. But that doesn't matter. I hope to raise some issues about how we should respond, particularly as people here who I think I could say are mostly at least over 65 or 60, and a few of us over 75. And how should we respond in this situation to these laws? Now, the laws actually went through the Parliament in April in a hell of a rush. And I need to go back through the debate and document who said what. But I can tell you the Labor Party lined up to push these laws through Parliament just as much as the LNP government did. And anyone who thinks that civil liberties are going to be advanced by a Labor government in New South Wales is really suffering from an illusion. Some of the people who spoke in favour of them included Jack Graham, who on some issues is, I think, probably quite good. Rose Jackson, Shadow Minister for Housing. And of course, Chris Minns really couldn't wait to see the past and condemn the people who protest. So they went through Parliament. Now, that didn't mean there weren't a lot of people speaking up and saying, you know, civil liberties organisations of various sorts. Like these days, we don't just have the Council for Civil Liberties, we have Human Rights Watch, we have the Human Rights Law Centre, we have the Environmental Defenders Office, and they all lined up to say very appropriate things, the Maritime Services Union, about the fact that these laws were going to victimise protesters and were aimed at stopping protests. Now, the heart of this is climate change. What they are afraid of, because no issue is more critical. I'm not saying it's the only critical issue, but no issue is more critical. We're faced with, and you think of this as individual and young people thinking about this, and old people thinking about this, that, I mean, you must all think about it too, that, you know, millions of lives, if not billions, are at stake in the future, the future that we can envisage. Many species can go into extinction, and we're meant to sit here and watch that happen. Meanwhile, fossil fuel interests right now in New South Wales are being facilitated. And these laws are to intimidate anyone from going out there and peacefully putting themselves in the way of work, whether it's along a road, near a tunnel, you know, it's just anything that can say stop. Stop traffic on the Harbour Bridge, stop a bridge working briefly. Meanwhile, of course, we had this whole Harbour Bridge shut down for a film shoot. And I was walking to the Botanical Gardens on Friday, coming home from the State Library, and thought I'll take a lovely walk through round to Circular Quay Station. And sure enough, it was all fenced off for the film shoot. So, you know, this sort of privatisation of space is meant to be taken for granted as a good thing. And meanwhile, you know, protest is being shut down. So I think that really is at the heart of the laws. Now, what no one sort of quite realised at the time was that they set up a police unit called Strike Force Guard. Now, this really is the sort of surveillance harassment unit. So when some people went up and had a peaceful camp up in the Blue Mountains, sort of training for non-violent resistance, as probably I'm sure a lot of you have done, suddenly, you know, the sort of undercover police in the bush filming, but not identifying themselves. So needless to say, people were not happy. Now, the people who were not even at the protest, I think it was probably a week later, the actual protest took place, the people who were arrested on the spot, who've not even yet had their cases heard, were in fact in prison, virtually in isolation, for, I can't say exactly how many days, but for a couple of weeks before they even got bail. And then I went out to court was in Penrith for the bail hearing, and I was really quite astonished to see, because this really is the police state of work. I was astonished to see not only draconian curfew conditions put on, so virtually you can't leave the house that you're living in, but names of 30 people read out in court that these people were not able to contact. That is their best friends. That is their political ally. So this, and this was just accepted as quite normal by the magistrate. And by then the lawyer, I think, was so worried about getting these people out on bail, and their parents had driven up from Melbourne. In fact, I was glad to see were very supportive and talking at a small rally in Hyde Park the day before. They wanted to just get them back to Melbourne out of prison. So that gave me a bit of a hint that there's a lot more happening. Like what you see happening when Violet Coco is sentenced to prison is just like the tip of the iceberg to what's happening. I know there's people here like Tim and Peter and others, and many others, probably Stuart, have all experienced this knowledge that people are watching and ready to act. Now, Violet Coco, or Deanne Violet Coco is her full name, was actually, she protested in May. So that is before she went onto the Harbour Bridge and stopped a truck. There was another person, 2 other people there too. She stood up on the truck and let a flare off. Now, you know, back in the days of the anti-apartheid protests, people ran onto Sydney Cricket Ground with flares. I was once arrested in Balmain in an anti-nuclear protest in possession of a flare. I was a little bit surprised to see later on my police record that I've got off a charge of possession of dangerous weapons, but I didn't actually realise the sort of horror that would be great with the idea of holding up a flare. I mean, I can see potentially they could carry risks, but this is again totally blown up. It was really a way of drawing attention. And so she went to court, and the magistrate gave her 18 months prison and 5 months non-parole. Now that is a hell of a sentence for a peaceful protest. Now, not only was the magistrate, and now the magistrate is actually on the extreme conservative side of the range of magistrates. You do have a range of magistrates. I know you all know that because different governments appoint them, or they've got different records and different experience before they go in. But this magistrate was on the extreme end. But who came in a really, if you want to talk about it in sort of political terms, who came in to absolutely back her up? It's Dominic Perrottet. Dominic Perrottet said, you know, throw the book at it. Throws the book at it. Well, that, you know, if you want to talk about separation of judicial and political powers, it's completely inappropriate. He didn't even really get condemned for it. I mean, the media seemed to think that was normal as well, and it's actually not normal. We're in the middle of a court case where you're going to have an appeal, and someone's been remanded on bail for Perrottet to be saying what he thought. Now, I think that Violet Coco, she was held the conditions, she was in the Silverwater Women's Prison. The conditions, ever since COVID particularly, have been very difficult. She was in a cell almost 24 hours a day, and she had no visitors. Now, and she was there for 10 days. Now, look, I haven't been in prison very long, but I was in prison for 8 days when I was in my 20s, twice. And, you know, I know what it's like to suddenly sort of feel you're in prison and you may well stay there, and how should you approach the next court hearing? And how much pressure I have brought to bear on me to sort of grovel to the court to get myself back out of prison. Now, I was there on remand for sentence. So I really have got a lot of respect for Violet Coco not backing down. She was very calm when she appeared in court from Silverwood. Of course, these days people don't even get the chance to get in a van, which may be not great, but get in a van, go to a cell, talk to some other people, go into court. You know, that's not necessarily something that everybody in prison would hate. But these days they're all just appearing from a video, and these are people facing, I've seen it because I've been in a few courts with these cases, seeing that some people are just, you know, already in remand for a year, and then they're going quickly before a magistrate, and then they're remanded for months more. So I think we do need to see all this in a context of deteriorating police conditions. Now, it was interesting to be in court because the magistrate judge, the judge, he's a district court judge. Sorry, I haven't got his name here, but anyway, district court judge really took a very different course. I said that really the sentence, the co-accused person with a separate magistrate has not gone to prison. He'd been outside the court making speeches about that, which I think was very helpful. And the judge said, look, he wouldn't expect that someone to get a custodial sentence for this. So even though, and this is always the way, even though the penalties are over there, the actual practice is something different. That doesn't mean it's not a major concern that the penalties are there, because who knows what some other magistrate or judge may do on some other occasion. I think it's pretty clear that when she goes back to court, Violet Coco, who's still continuing to support protesters and post on her Facebook, probably won't go to prison. But meanwhile, where does that leave us? Now, I think the situation and need to oppose these laws is a very serious and challenging one. The Environmental Law Office, they've now sort of merged EDO with the Victorian organisation into a more national organisation. They have challenged the laws under the implied right to freedom of communication in the Australian Constitution. However, that will be a hard case to win, as anyone who knows much about how carefully and restrictively the High Court has applied. That nevertheless, they're collecting a lot of important information about past practices with protests. So I don't want to talk too long, but I thought I might just sort of remind us, and I'm really interested in any feedback from people here about, are we, did we have a right to protest? Have we lost that right to protest? Or was it just that we sort of took it for granted and became very compliant along the way? Before I came here, I looked up earliest book I've got on freedom in Australia, which was published by Enid Campbell, and that was published in 1966. And the section is virtually nothing on demonstrations, and it says there had been a few more protests lately, and it's pretty clear we didn't have the right to public assembly or processions, is what it was called, processions. Now, in practice, one of the first, not the first, but one of the first protests I went to in Sydney was the Gurindji one in 1970. And, we gathered up at Wynyard, and the wharfies were there protecting sort of the demonstration, and walked down George Street, and it was very violent. The police were violent, and about 35 people got arrested. I remember appearing in Central Court, and a young lawyer then called George Senkovsky was there to represent everyone for free. And they're not even sure that most of those cases ever actually went to court. But we did walk down the street, and I don't think there was a permit. Now, just jump forward to the later in the 70s. Now, some of the things that Women Behind Bars did was we stopped the traffic on the Harbour Bridge at a very busy time on a Saturday night with a few old cars, and nothing happened to anyone. I'm not saying the police were happy, but we did do that. We broke into Long Bay Prison to get Katingal shut down, which was the maximum security unit. The police back then were just as corrupt and would lie in court. There were a major problem with the way the police exercised their power, and many people were framed in court, including Tim, who's here in the audience. So I don't want to paint a glossy picture at all, but the fact is we camped in Chipley Square with Women Behind Bars to get Sandra Wilson out of prison for quite a long time. We camped outside Corrective Services to get Violet Roberts out of prison, equally a long time. I can't even remember the police even speaking to us after a while. We were just there. Now, I don't think we could do that today. So to that extent, I think we have moved backwards. Because now I feel we've either got to be on the pavement or get a permit, and if you get a permit, you might not get one. And with the Mardi Gras, that was the first Mardi Gras was extraordinarily violent. I didn't see a lot of the violence because I was actually arrested basically before it even started in Hyde Park. I was arrested several times as a form of preventative arrest. And so was Dennis Freeman, who in the appeal on a couple of occasions too. But Peter Murphy, who's here, knows how violent it was that night. Now, I remember there was a meeting before the next Mardi Gras, and I have a series of photos taken of it by a very good photographer called Digby Duncan. And it's actually on my wall, and it's caused me to think about this meeting a lot. This meeting was a debate. Peter, were you there?
I think I was.
I think you might have been. I can't remember which way you voted, so you may not either. But this was a debate about whether to get a permit or not for the second Mardi Gras. Now, I can tell you some of the people. I argued against it. Virginia Bell argued against it, who went on to be on the High Court. There's various other people who argued against it. You can see them in the frame, and then there was some other people who argued for it. My memory is that the people who wanted to go for the permit won. Now, I'm not saying they were wrong, because I really am not sure about that at all. I've never had a very clear fix on whether permits for marches were historically a good way to go. I've never felt comfortable about it, but that's probably because I'm fairly anti-authoritarian. But you know, this whole idea that you go, you fill in forms and you go, and I have seen a lot of very viable protests held that way, including deaths in custody protests. So I don't sort of want to be overly negative, but there is a problem with the practice that got set up, that you couldn't exercise your right to protest unless, that is, walk down the street, not the footpath, be in the middle of the square peacefully if you think the issue warrants it. And yes, possibly accepts the consequences for that. But that sort of slid away somewhere along the way. So I think that's really something worth thinking about and debating. Now, with the protest laws, as I said, this is a legal challenge. Also, 230 organisations have signed up opposing these laws. That is the biggest sort of coalition of NGOs and civil rights organisations since the Vietnam War. So there are many people are behind the action. The Greens are absolutely for, they have put up disallowance motions, they have voted against it, they have argued against it. The Greens are very strongly against it, of course, any group on the left. But I don't know exactly where it's going. And I mean, I think about this and I think, and I guess we all do, but, you know, the only way, in my view, to get rid of these laws is probably to challenge them, to physically challenge them. Perhaps this High Court case will be successful, great if it is. But, you know, Narrabri is coming up. And this is the gas pipeline. It is insanity. The Gomeroi people, most of them are opposed to it. The farmers are opposed to it. It is insane to be digging 230 gas wells in a gas field. People have been fighting it peacefully for years. The grandmothers against coal seam gas have been there with hundreds of protests, little protests, but still good protests. And, you know, it's going to come to a crunch. Now, I've heard the MUA say twice a protest, once outside the Liverpool court when Coco was appearing. There was a rally there. I've heard them say that they will blockade. Well, good. If they do, I'll certainly be there, hopefully, too. It's a long way to go, however, maybe there's a different way to do it. But, you know, I think at the end of the day, it's got to be more than, and I don't want to be in a position of telling anyone what to do, because, I mean, really, it's everybody's choice, and that sounds very individualistic. But, you know, I ask myself, you know, really, am I prepared to do this? Am I prepared to accept the consequences? Because I do think that so far, these laws are a massive threat. I think people are scared of going out there and being arrested. I think they are pulling back on protests. In London, Extinction Rebellion have said that they're not going to use their tactics anymore because they've been convinced they're not constructive. And that could be the correct position for some of the things they were doing. But in the last few days, scientists for Rebellion have come out and said they are going to, these are people, many, many scientists who are saying it is too late already, but the stakes are so high, we're going to engage in civil disobedience. So, you know, people will make that decision, and I think it's just a question for all of us. Thank you.
Okay, we've only got one microphone, and we've got lots of questions and comments, I think. So we just want the person asking the question or comment to give their name first, and then to maximum 2 minutes. Finish with the question if your comments. So who's first? Down here, Jefferson, go.
Thanks to those speakers. I put out a comment on a YouTube, I posted 2 or 3 days to a lot of you here, saying that the media tactic leading up to the state election concerning the police is not happening by accident. 2 days after the Premier was exposed as him and his Minister Tuto as were exposed in 4 corners as leading lights in Opus Dei, which is persecuting homosexuals in their schools. They're 4 government-funded schools with over $5 million going into these 4 schools for Opus Dei. A lot of dissident ex-students on 4 corners. 2 days after that, we had the New South Wales Police cracking down on 690 or 670 wayward implied fathers, their parents who haven't paid their child maintenance or are guilty of domestic violence, which everybody will say that's a terrible thing. Anyone guilty of domestic violence should face the full weight of the law. But it's just like this wave of crackdowns where, 2,000 police were involved all over the state. And then the assistant police commissioner, I'll get to the question, the assistant police commissioner comes on and says, well, we've set up this special squad and we're implementing this law that everybody supports, just like we have with the fixated persons unit. Hello, Friendly Jolie's case. Hello, the koala case where an environmentalist has been bashed severely by the Liberal lobbyists of the state forest, which Friendly Jolie's have also covered. This fixated persons unit, I mentioned one of the unit, the anti-bikie squad that's ongoing, of course. Now, I'd be curious to know the opinion of both Stuart or Wendy about the role of the media and the way the police and the government are using it with these mass arrests sort of things, as though there's a huge crackdown on crime. And of course, we've got all these ongoing surreptitious drug cases all the time, putting much credibility in the police. My final comment here is it seems that the laws are still going to be implemented selectively. Wendy goes on about the lack of free speech, but it seems after 200 sessions of Friday night between 4 and 7 of the Free Assange campaign, it has not been attended by the police over the last 100 weeks, and the police have never seriously moved on the Stephen Langford's little refugee corner with his dog, or the Free Assange campaigns, even used megaphones at the Sydney Town Hall every Friday. So it seems they're very selective in which issues they're going to pursue. That's my general statement and question.
Who wants to take it?
I really do think. Yeah. So, I really agree with you, Jefferson. I didn't know about the issue you raised about the squad and going out with getting 600 people. I actually missed that altogether. But I think in general terms, I think the media is, again, I'm really loath to generalize, but I think very easily manipulated now, partly through poor practices like not enough, not following up things, not, I mean, I don't know if it's a time issue or not anymore, but, stories can just get planted, but they don't get followed up. I've also sort of thought about the issue of these crackdowns on, guns and all this sort of thing. And for years I've been wondering, well, how come there are so many guns around? Is that selective policing? And why don't we ever hear anything about police corruption anymore? Because there's no way that I'm persuaded that the New South Wales Police have still not got pockets of corruption, which again goes to your question also about whether selective policing with protesting as well. And I mean, I think I personally think there's all sorts of diversions all the time to stop us paying attention to certain issues. So I'm not disagreeing with you for a minute, and I think your media analysis is pretty spot on.
Thanks, Wendy. Who's next for the question or comment? Okay. Same there.
Thank you, Wendy, for the
Hold it.
beginning.
Hold it.
Very beginning, you said repression is not across the board. It's different. It varies. It's not the same. And indeed, you're right. And I think often, if I go back to it, the invasion of Iraq and the so-called preemptive strikes and the repercussions of that, there's a dead story. Oops, it was an intel mistake. Today, the country is decimated. It could take another generation to. The same applies to the surveillance. Surveillance is a shallow word. It's far more than that. It's not a passive term. You surveil our repercussions, physical and psychological. I won't be able to take, but I implore everyone to really review the concept of surveillance. It is not an anti-term. It's not about just watching.
Yeah.
Want to
I
comment?
agree with that too. I agree, it's not. Stuart, would you like to say something about that from the surveillance point of view? I agree, it's not passive. And there's all sorts of active tactics that go along with it, including destroying people's reputation, shutting down, making them feel very actively watched. What would you say, Stuart?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think it's interesting that you referred to the invasion of Iraq, because that's the cue for the abusive use of power in just about every context and country that you can think of, and that applies to the conduct and recognition of civil liberties in institutions like universities. So it's not just the compliance and the authoritarian attitude of the police and politicians who pass these anti-protest laws, because the abusive use of power is so easy. I mean, it was education for centuries was founded on that premise. You just do you repeat what I tell you and do as I say. And think of that and with regard to the media, I'd defer to Wendy on this, but it seems to me it's so diverse. A lot of people that I know only ever read Pearl's Irritation, because they frequently say the only way I can get my finger on the pulse of what might be going on is to turn to Pearl's and Irritations and ignore everything else. I can't be more helpful at that at this point. Short answer, Jefferson. What did you think of that?
I didn't know.
Okay.
What's
Tim?
your-
No.
I'll just make a comment on what Wendy was talking about, the right to protest, because I was involved in some publications through the 90s. Into the 90s, we put out a few editions of activist rights handbook, funded by the UTS Student Union, and the version we close on depending on the court case, youth street rights research project. And then at the end of the 90s, Louise Burko and I at the UTS Law Centre were doing something on what were the rights to protest in the upcoming Olympics period. You know, at the time when the Eagle Labour government led by Rob Carr was implementing new anti-protest laws and foreshore laws and so on. But anyway, the perspective I gained on that was that it really, because of the general legal system we exist, there are very few clearly defined rights in law. And effectively, we have been able to use them in the past because there weren't laws against it. You know, we look at the debt embassy in 1971. It's because the regulation of camping grounds didn't apply until there was 12 tents or more. You know? And so there were all these loopholes, more or less, until they changed the law to block these sorts of things. That's why it appears, I think it's true, that protests in the 70s were a more casual sort of thing and subject to more arbitrary sort of interventions. You know, things became a lot more regulated later on. Now, the problem with pursuing a rights claim in the courts these days, implied political freedom or whatever under the federal constitution is, and as you all know, we have a 19th century colonial constitution, which is a very difficult thing to try and pack progressive things onto. The one generally against the idea of trying to pack a Bill of Rights or special interests onto these sorts of things, because they don't even begin with citizens. We don't even have in principle the idea of a citizen, that is to say, a vessel or a right. We are all subjects of a foreign monarchy, effectively, and this is why a lot of us voted against the Republican clause, the Republican referendum in '99, because it was really to give the government of the day the right to appoint a president and then, get rid of the monarchy in some sort of way. But we've never really had a serious discussion about citizens, which should be the vessel of rights. So I am lukewarm about the idea of talking about bills of rights, special interest groups having voices and so on like that, because we haven't come to terms with the idea that citizens constitute a republic and you can't just change it with a magic wand. And that means people having a say in certain things that go into the constitution, like the right to healthcare and things like that, which are immensely popular. But of course, the minimalist Republican people have always steered people away from anything that would allow a popular voice in those sorts of issues. So I think that's where the right to protest sits. I don't think there's much room to move in a high court action there, because the constitution is set up to allow very limited sort of rights, mainly free trade between the states and a few things like that. Not establishing a religion at federal level because of historical reasons. But there has been an unwillingness to sort of to come to terms with the old colonial constitution that we have, more or less. And so, in that respect, I'm not very optimistic about changes. But the right to protest is being throttled down by a series of laws, chasing through every decade, probably, whether it be new generations of laws which allow protest in a way, in a very bureaucratized sort of way, where people, I understand that they go and get a permit for a protest. I'm with Wendy with that sort of thing. Like, why would you assume responsibility for a protest? The police want that, so they can hold someone responsible. If you just turn up, you're exercising your right of freedom of assembly. So there's the problem in the current legal system. Sorry.
Thank you.
I'd just say that thanks very much, Tim. That's all really important information. I really like to hope that you write an article about some of this, because I think you're probably one of the best informed people on this topic. I would be pessimistic about anything true, as I said, to be quite right. But also, I think it's really interesting what you said about the Constitution, because I think it really, this colonial constitution that we've got really means that any amendment or change is going to be, has to be one that's very conservative, to appeal to a sufficient number of people, and I think that's pretty clear.
Yeah, Tim, your commentary about rights is valuable. The trouble is that rights only impact on the consciousness of citizens in extreme cases, like Violet Kogos or Shokrat Mossamain or Julian Assange. Against that, against the controversy that surrounds those individual cases, is a huge culture of conformity. Better that we don't know at all, better than everything be conducted in secret. We look what's going on at the moment in the Northern Territory, the American military's preparation for a war against China. And the AUKUS agreement, we're being told by Richard Miles, is going to be the building of the final signing of the agreement. It's going to be the greatest day, most significant day in the history of Australia. And yet the concern with secrecy, I mean, most people have a clue about what's happening in the Pine Gap listening station. So that the rights only gain leverage on public consciousness in cases like Violet Kogos or perhaps less Shokrat, but certainly in the case of Julian Assange, because otherwise most people are asleep. I mean, I put a big sticker that you gave me, you're responsible for this, about a year ago, it's in the back of my car, it says free Julian Assange. And a group of guys I had coffee with down the coast said, "Who's Julian Assange?" So I'm not answering that question.
Okay, we've got time for another question. Hang on a second.
Thank you, Lucian, for another very good contribution. My big concern is there's a growing willingness even in the public among Australians to give up their civil liberty when it involves media and sometimes even other experts to tickle insecurities, fears, and visceral issues that range from xenophobia to health. I won't be too shy about it, but what we went through COVID was a test. And I think, in my sad opinion, Australia, the Australian public, failed that test of vigilance over their civil rights and liberties. I'd like to get your comments on that. Thank you.
Well, you know, Jacques, I mean, you probably say this many times. I mean, one of the most important qualities is courage in public life. It's difficult to find. Particularly when I go to Canberra to talk to politicians, either about Julian Assange or about the cruelty and frankly the evil policies of a fascist government towards the Palestinians. I mean, most of my legal friends say, well, the politicians are scared out of their wits, even now, to say something critical about the conduct of the Israeli government. And for a long time, if you wanted to identify the site of cancer in international relations, that's where it was. But the failure to, as you say, the willingness to give up civil liberties, the other side of that coin is to find the courage to say what you know, in Tom Paine tradition, what are the rights of men and women, and that courage. I mean, I've often said to politicians, Christ, why don't you try courage twice a day after meals? It's quite good for you. But I mean, there's a very courageous person sitting down there who might want
In a way, what she said is very relevant because, I mean, you say people are prepared to let their rights go, but I think what Tim has pointed out, we don't actually have rights. And when these laws are passed, they're taking away our ability, if we choose to do things. And that puts us in the sort of defensive position, really, of challenging it and running the risk. And, you know, I just on the whole COVID thing, look, it's a very complicated conversation that I personally feel that public health restrictions class some other things. I personally, however, was not victimised or policed in a way that some people in Western Sydney were. And that inequality is at every point in our criminal justice system and has been since colonisation in every way. So to me, that inequality in policing that happened with COVID is yet another expression of that. But you only have to go, and I don't know where you live, but I live in the inner city. But I also go to the western suburbs, and when I go, I just see so many more police taking so many more intrusive actions. And that's the real problem. Or one of the big problems.
Okay, well, I mean, going over to Stephen. Frank? No. Stephen, then Frank.
Thank you. I got one before. When we were saying about the permission or a sort of permission, they call it a permit, not a permit. But it's gone for a static sort of demonstration that's not doing any harm to anyone. But it's called registration or something like that. But the police will call it a permit as if you need permit. And what's that's doing to protesters as well? I mean, someone at a protest outside Albanese's office, a fellow protester, called the police on me because I put the supposedly put a banner in the wrong place, not causing any damage or harm. But that's what happened, and the police came. Otherwise, they wouldn't have known. So that's what. And I've noticed in some demonstrations, people come forward and give the information to the police more than willingly, as if this is going to give them brownie points or something. It's the most curious thing that I didn't know as an experienced protester until this happened. What was going to say? I think that some people here will remember Peter McGregor, and he said something very true. The rights are what you fight for. They're not something you really have, even if some paper, they're just paper barriers. But something you have to fight for, then you have them. So that's why we should all get out there and assert these rights that we surely have, that we have because we assert them. So thank you.
You take it to Frank. Yes.
I think I've got the last question, so I'll make it a philosophical and general one. Coming in my mind as you've been both speaking, that there's a tension between a focus on civil liberty and on a broader questions of social justice. Now, these aren't the same. And I think your last set of comments, when you seem to imply that civil liberties are preconditions, I just wanted to ask you both, in winding up the session today, to reflect on whether there's some tensions between these actions. Not just the tension of where, as a left activist, you might want to put your energy, you know, all of it limited in what we can focus, but a broader question about whether or not one is a precondition for the other.
Okay. Stuart can go first.
My experience is that you have to practice the issues of civil liberties. You have to practice the skills of protest in order to get a sense of confidence about what you mean about social justice. And I mean, in a way, there's a kind of reciprocal relationship between the two. I mean, I remember the Defend and Extend Medicare campaign that went on for 18 months, mostly with the MUA down at the docks, to keep universal health insurance on the statute books when the AMA or the procedural specialists tried to get rid of it. The social justice issue was about not penalising anybody for being sick via access to universal health insurance. That was the social justice goal. But we had to organise protests to ensure that the government could hear the alternative, that there was an alternative voice representing the interests and rights, if you like, of patients, in order to fill in all the blank spaces in the social justice picture, which was universal health insurance.
That's a very good question and a very important one. I think that, first of all, there is no just society unless you have people have social justice. And I think that so long as people do not have secure housing, so long as they don't have same access to the right to live, that is right to live a long, healthy life, which is just massive global injustice. At the end of the day, that's the fundamental issue. And I think that civil liberties, it is interesting that just looking back, civil liberties tend to, like, if I think of the Civil Liberties Council, the CCL in New South Wales, that was established by, in particular, a person called Ken Buckley, who was a sort of Labour type socialist, but he also became very concerned. He came from the UK and became very concerned about the exercise of police powers in New South Wales. And I've been reading a bit about that lately and thinking about it again. But my own experience sort of drew that to my attention when I was charged with exhibiting the Senate publication 70. And I decided to represent myself. And I used some civil liberties lawyers, including Ken Horler, who was a leading one at that time. And, I went to ask him to lend me some law books so that I could study up on this consenting law. And he was furious with me for wanting to defend myself because he absolutely wanted to push through, as they did in the Portnoy's complaint case, to push through on literary merit. And at the time, I argued, also Sydney, with the Sydney Push at the time, Sydney Libertarians, arguing that literary merit was an elitist notion, and this should be something, you know, if there was going to be people that get access to literature, this should apply to everybody. Anyway, that was an argument at that time, and subsequently I ended up on the committee for CCL, and there was a huge brawl. This is in the 1970s at the time. I can't remember exactly when, but it was after we were involved with the green bans, and we've been occupying Victoria Street. And I wanted to argue on this committee that housing was something that civil libertarians, access to housing, something civil libertarians would be involved with, and where everyone had a right to housing. And I can only tell you, apparently, according to some retired judge who told me that I ended up with tears. I don't have any of you ending up with tears. But I had George Peterson, Ken Buckley, and other Labor people absolutely on their faces that I had to be shut down. And there were a few young lawyers who supported me. It was mainly lawyers on the committee. Anyway, I've sort of conceded the CCL has rejuvenated itself. There's a new young president called Josh Tallis who seems to be doing a pretty good job. And I think their work is badly needed at the moment around these issues of assisting people and all of that. So I don't want to be, but I think this question of what is liberty, and you get the same in whenever you look at freedom of expression. And some people have written some pretty good stuff on this, but is it just a sort of small L liberal right that does not really apply or more fundamental social justice issues is, you know, a real question. Just one other tiny point on that, which may not seem relevant, but when we talk about freedom of the press or media freedom, they usually are just, you know, you'll notice that with Murdoch is quite happy to, the whole Murdoch operation is quite happy to climb aboard certain sorts of, you know, if like people get raided, you know, that's a horror story, you know, that's just dreadful and we've got to reform the media laws. In fact, there's a good person called John, what's he, up at Sydney Uni, anyway, he argued that there's an illusion in sort of excluding private power from covering ideas of media from freedom of expression, that unless we look at, say, the power that Murdoch exercises and how, or did exercise anyway, and how that excludes whole sections of the population. Unless we look at that question, how to have a more accessible media, more democratic media, we can forget media freedom. So anyway, that's just a few comments on that. I think it's a very deep question. That's probably an adequate answer.
Look, my job is to sum up and to foreshadow the next meeting. In a way, the history of politics in the pub is an illustration of an effort to answer your question, Frank. I mean, for 40 years or more, it's been going, and for 35 years, it was, believe it or not, once a week, and then a certain wisdom crept in, and we met once a fortnight. We were slowly evicted from one place to another. The most sensational eviction was from the Gaelic club because we didn't drink enough Guinness. And even the crisis that leads us here to this evening, and that has ensured that politics in the pub will now meet only once a month, in a way is somehow about the suppression of public issues about civil liberties and social justice and so on. Anyway, so that's a bouquet I'm giving to Politics in the Pub. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Wendy. It's great to have you back here. On the 7th of May, the question is, who is afraid of the gaming card? And Frank, former professor of political economy, I mean, still a professor of political economy as far as I'm concerned. Frank Stillwell is the speaker, and the other famous speaker listed on several occasions is called TBC, to be confirmed.
One last thing. Contact with our optimistic.
Okay.
Well, goodbye.
Okay, great. Well, that is 7th of May. By that time, the Greens government will have been elected in New South Wales.
Can I just make a quick Thursday between 5 and 6, following on from what Geoffrey said, the Lowy Institute up in Fly Street in Chipley Square in Sydney between 5 and 6 next Thursday are launching a book on Islamic terrorism taking over Australia with 3 speakers in 1 hour and one with a series short. But the book will obviously generate a lot of Murdoch hysteria. It is going over the 200 Islamic terrorists in Australia, including the women who are stranded still in Syria. Some of them have come back. But a lot of the cases involve what lawyer Greg Barnes in Melbourne has said are total setups of teenage 15 and 16-year-old followers of Islam have been enticed online by ASIO to issue threats and to prepare for acts of public violence, only to be caught in their homes or before they even carry out such acts. And a lot of them have been charged of threatening Australia's security to promote Islamic terrorism. It'd be good if a few people through the Lowy Institute get down there next Thursday, even a public demonstration outside of them. It's obviously that they're going to deny any legitimate questions from the floor. But I'm just saying it's 5 to 6 next Thursday. They're launching it with 2 well-known military intelligence security people. It's written by one of the famous Shanahans, Richard Shanahan, who's military intelligence, and I think is probably a relative of the other Shanahans that work on the Australian newspaper.
Okay, thanks very much.
Point that out. One can get there. It's free to register, but it's like a few days it's going to be like.
Thank you. Okay, Kathy, I'm going to stop it somewhere.
I'm also I only brought 7 copies in fact now. If anyone can get donation, possibly 250 each. If you haven't got any money, please take a copy. It shows the